Chapter 1, A Ticket to Nowhere, 680 words. The stagecoach rattled down the main street of Dry Creek, its wheels kicking up a cloud of ochre dust that clung to the air and made the sunlight look hazy. Inside, Isla Mayhew sat stiff-backed on the worn leather seat, clutching the small carpet bag that contained all she owned in the world. Her gloves were frayed at the fingertips, her dress plain but pressed, chosen carefully to make her look respectable enough for a man she had never met. The coach slowed, the driver hollering to his team as the horses' hooves clopped unevenly over the warped planks of the boardwalk that edged the street. Through the smudged window glass, Isla caught sight of the town, a scattering of weathered buildings crouched against the endless prairie, their wooden signs faded by sun and wind. A saloon stood hard at all, its bat-wing doors swinging as men in dusty hats came and went, spurs jingling, laughter spilling out into the street along with the faint, tinny notes of a piano. The coach jolted to a stop in front of the general store. The driver climbed down, and the door swung open, letting in a blast of warm air smelling of horse sweat and sagebrush. "Dry Creek," he announced, offering his hand. Isla stepped down, her boots meeting the creaking planks of the sidewalk. Her gaze darted left and right, searching for man from the letters. Walter Bragg, rancher, widower, and her intended by mail. She had rehearsed the moment over and over during the long ride west, imagining a smile, perhaps even a touch of kindness in his eyes. What she found instead was a man leaning against a hitching post, arms crossed over a broad chest, his eyes shaded by the brim of his hat. He didn't step forward to greet her, just gave her a slow, assessing look as if sizing up a piece of livestock. "You're the girl," he said at last, voice flat as the prairie horizon. "I'm Isla Mayhew," she replied, forcing a small smile. "From Charleston. We've been writing for her." "I know who you are." His gaze flicked her bag. "That all you got?" She nodded, her smile faltering. "Well, we best get you to the ranch. Ain't no sense standing around here." He took her bag without asking and turned toward a waiting wagon. Isla followed, but as she passed the saloon, she felt eyes on her. A man sat astride a tall bay gelding just beyond the hitching rail, his weathered face half hidden beneath a shadowed hat brim. He didn't look away when she met his gaze. Something in his eyes, something steady, quiet, and almost protective, made her pause mid-step. Walter's voice cut through the moment. "You comin'?" She tore her gaze away from the rider and climbed into the wagon. Walter flicked the reins, and the horses lurched forward. The wagon wheels rolled over the ruts in the dirt street, the town sliding past in a blur of faded signs and half-curious faces. As they left Dry Creek behind, the land opened wide and endless, the prairie grass swaying in waves beneath a sky so big it made her dizzy. She had dreamed of this openness back in the cramped boarding house in Charleston, but sitting beside Walter, silent, his jaw set tight, she felt no freedom. The wagon hit a bump, jostling her against him. He didn't shift, didn't glance her way, just muttered something about fixing the road. She folded her hands in her lap and tried to ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. In the distance, the sound of a lone coyote's howl drifted on the wind. Isla looked back over her shoulder toward the tiny speck of Dry Creek and thought she saw the rider still there, watching from the edge of town. For reasons she couldn't name, the thought was oddly comforting. Chapter 2, The Coldest Supper, 670 words. The sun had long since dipped behind the low hills by the time Walter Bragg's wagon rolled up to the ranch. Shadows stretched across the dry yard, where a few chickens scratched in the dirt and an old barn sagged like it had been carrying secrets for years. The house loomed at the center, 2 stories of weather-beaten boards, its windows catching the faintest glow of lamplight. Walter climbed down first, tossing Isla's carpetbag onto the porch with a thud. "Don't expect much," he muttered, pushing open the front door. Inside, the air was cooler but carried a faint, sour smell of stale tobacco and unwashed dishes. The floorboards creaked under Isla's boots as she stepped into a room with mismatched furniture and a faded rug that had seen better days. A woman's voice called from the kitchen. "That her?" Walter's sister appeared in the doorway, a sharp-faced woman with hair pulled tight and an expression that could slice leather. Her eyes skimmed Isla from head to toe like she was measuring fabric. "She's scrawnier than the last one," the woman said plainly. "Hope she's got more backbone." Heat rose to Isla's cheeks, but she said nothing. Walter grunted, hanging his hat on a hook. "Supper's ready?" The table was set with 3 chipped plates, a loaf of bread hacked unevenly, and a pot of beans that smelled faintly burnt. Isla slid into a chair, folded her hands in her lap as Walter and his sister took their seats. They ate in near silence, the scrape of cutlery the only sound. Isla tried to swallow down the beans, but each bite seemed to turn to dust in her mouth. The lamplight flickered, casting long shadows over Walter's face. "You'll need to be up before sunup," Walter said finally, not looking at her. "Chores don't wait for the new bride." "I understand," Isla murmured. His sister smirked faintly, sipping from a tin cup. "We'll see." The words carried a weight Isla couldn't quite name, but it settled in her stomach heavier than the food. She reached for the bread, her hands trembling just enough that she pulled back before anyone noticed. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. The sound reminded her of the stagecoach ride, of the brief moment she'd locked eyes with that stranger in town, Colton Hayes, though she didn't yet know his name. She wondered why his look had stayed with her, why it felt different from the blunt appraisals of every other man she'd passed. Walter's voice snapped her back. "After supper, you can get yourself settled upstairs. My room's at the end of the hall. Yours is next to it. Keep your things neat. I don't like clutter." "Of course," she said, her voice quieter now. The rest of the meal passed without another word. Walter pushed back his chair, leaving half his beans untouched, and went to pour himself a whiskey from a bottle on the sideboard. His sister began stacking plates without asking for help. Isla rose, gathering her own dish. The woman took it from her with a curt nod. "Don't wander tonight," she said under her breath. "Best you learn the ways of the house before you start thinking you belong in it." Isla hesitated, unsure whether it was advice or a warning. Upstairs, the small room she was shown had a narrow bed, a washstand with a cracked basin, and a single window that looked out over the prairie. She set her bag on the bed and sank down beside it, staring at the shadows that danced along the wall. From below came the faint clink of glass, the low rumble of Walter's voice talking to his sister, and a burst of sharp laughter she didn't understand. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote howled, long, low, and lonely. Isla laid down, fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling. She had thought coming here would be her escape, but the silence pressing in from all sides made her wonder if she'd only stepped into another kind of prison. Chapter 3. A Cowboy's Warning, 660 words. The next morning, the sky was a pale, cloudless blue, already promising heat. Isla stood outside the general store in Dry Creek, her hands wrapped around the small paper parcel of coffee beans Walter had sent her to fetch. The sun beat down on the back of her neck, and she could feel the grit of dust on her lips every time the wind shifted. She had been in town less than 10 minutes, yet she felt every set of eyes on her. Some were curious, others indifferent, but all of them knew she was a new mail-order bride. The gossip in a town like Dry Creek traveled faster than a prairie fire. The batwing doors of the saloon swung open across the street, spilling out a mix of cigar smoke, the twang of a fiddle, and 2 men arguing over a card game gone wrong. Horses shifted along the hitching rail, their reins clinking against weathered posts. That's when she saw him. Colton Hayes was leaning against a rail in front of the blacksmith's, one boot crossed over the other, his hat tilted low. His shirt sleeves were rolled up to the elbow, showing forearms brown and scarred from years of work. He watched her for a long moment before pushing off the rail and crossing the street, his spurs jingling softly with each step. "Mrs. Bragg," he said, his voice low, but carrying over the rattle of a passing wagon. She hesitated. "Miss Mayhew," she corrected quietly. We aren't married yet." His eyes narrowed, not in judgment, but like he was filing the information away. "That's so." She nodded, shifting the parcel in her hands. "It's only been a few days since I arrived." Colton glanced toward the saloon, then back to her. "Mind if I walk you to your wagon?" "I don't think that would be wise," she said, her voice barely above the hum of the street. "Walter wouldn't like it?" Colton finished for her. Figured as much. Her pulse quickened. "Why are you talking to me, mister?" "Hayes. Colton Hayes." He adjusted his hat. "And I'm talking to you because I've seen men like Walter Bragg before." She looked away, staring down the dusty main street. "You don't know him." "I know enough." His tone wasn't sharp, but steady, like a man stating a fact. "And I know you should watch yourself." The wind picked up, tugging at the hem of her skirt and sending a swirl of dust between them. She tried to meet his gaze, but found it too steady, too knowing. "There a reason you're warning me?" she asked. Colton shifted his weight, glancing briefly toward the sheriff's office across the street. A faded wanted poster fluttered on the wall, its edges curling in the heat. She caught the faint letters of a name that looked disturbingly familiar, one that Walter had mentioned in his letters, claiming the man had cheated him in business. "Let's just say," Colton replied slowly, "you don't want to be on the wrong side of him." And Walter's temper, he shook his head, "it ain't a thing you can tame." Before she could answer, the sound of boot heels striking the boardwalk made her turn. Walter was striding toward them from the livery, his eyes locked on her. Colton stepped back, his voice dropping even lower. "If you need help, you find me. Out east of town, past the cottonwoods." Walter reached them, his expression unreadable, but his jaw set tight. "We done here?" he asked Isla, not sparing Colton a glance. She swallowed hard. "Yes." Walter took the parcel from her hands and nodded toward the wagon. "Get in." As she climbed onto the seat, she risked a glance over her shoulder. Colton was still there, leaning against the post again, his gaze following her. Not like a man watching something he wanted, but like a man watching something he couldn't leave to the wolves. Chapter 4. Bruises and Truths, 660 words. The trouble started with a poker game. Walter had been gone most of the afternoon, riding into town with a scowl on his face and dust kicking up behind his horse. By the time he returned, the sun had bled red across the horizon, and the prairie wind carried the smell of whiskey and cigar smoke on his clothes. Isla was setting the table when the door banged open so hard it rattled the hinges. Walter stalked in, boots thudding against the floorboards, his hat hanging from 2 fingers. "Beans again," he muttered, eyeing the pot on the stove. "It's what your sister said we had." Isla answered quietly, ladling the beans into a bowl. "She would," he said under his breath, then turned sharp eyes on Isla. "You think I made a fool of, huh?" She froze. "I don't know what you mean." "Lost 2 hands to that swindler pipe tonight. Then I hear whispers in the saloon about my new bride talking to Colton Hayes." His voice rose, and he took a step closer. "What were you telling him, Isla?" "Nothing," she said, trying to keep her tone steady. He was being polite. "That's all." Walter's lip curled. "Polite? Men don't look at another man's woman like that." Before she could move, his hand shot out and gripped her arm hard enough to make her gasp. She tried to pull back, but his fingers dug in deeper. "You'll keep your distance from him," he said, his breath hot with whiskey. Then, As if to punctuate the point, he shoved her toward the table. She caught herself on the edge, the jolt rattling her teeth. For a moment, she just stood there, the room spinning, her arm throbbing where he grabbed her. Walter muttered something about uppity women and stomped out to the porch, the screen door slamming behind him. It took her a full minute to realize she was shaking. The next morning, Walter sent her to the well for water, claiming his horse needed watering before the heat set in. She pulled on her shawl, though it didn't hide the purpling bruise blooming along her forearm. When she reached the well, the rope creaking under the bucket's weight, she noticed movement out of the corner of her eye. Colton Hayes sat on his horse just beyond the fence, watching her with that same steady gaze she'd seen in town. "Mornin'," he called, tipping his hat. She nodded but didn't speak, lowering the bucket into the cool darkness. "You're awful quiet," he said after a moment. His eyes dropped to where her sleeve had slipped, revealing the dark mark on her arm. His jaw tightened. That from him. She pulled the fabric back into place. "It's none of your concern." "Maybe not." He swung down from the saddle and walked closer, boots crunching on the dry ground. "But a decent man doesn't put marks on a woman." Isla gripped the bucket handle, feeling the rough rope burn against her palms. "If you say things like that, and Walter hears—" "I don't give a damn what Walter hears," Colton said, voice low but firm. "I'm telling you plain, there's another way to live, Isla. You don't have to stay here." She looked up then, meeting his eyes. There was no pity there, just certainty. The prairie wind tugged at his shirt, carried the faint scent of leather and dust between them. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I have nowhere else to go." "You got somewhere," he said. "My place is out past the cottonwoods. If you ever decide you've had enough, you ride there. You'll be safe." The sound of boots on the porch behind her made her breath catch. Walter's voice carried across the yard. "Colton, what are you doing here?" Colton didn't turn around. "Just saying good morning." Walter's footsteps thudded closer. Isla glanced between them, feeling the air tighten like a coiled rope. Colton finally stepped back, mounting his horse in one smooth motion. "Think about what I said," he told her, his eyes holding hers for one last heartbeat before he turned the horse toward the open prairie. Walter's glare followed him until he was a speck on the horizon. Then his attention snapped back to her. "What did I tell you about talking to him?" Her stomach churned, but she didn't lower her eyes this time. Maybe Colton was wrong. Or maybe she'd already had enough. Chapter 5. The Long Night Ride. 670 words. The storm rolled in fast, carried on a wind that bent the cottonwoods and swept dust across the prairie in stinging waves. Isla stood by the kitchen window, watching the sky darken to the color of gunmetal. Walter had been drinking since sundown, the sharp scent of whiskey drifting from the parlor, where he muttered to himself over a half-empty bottle. She had tried to stay out of his way, but when the back door banged open and his boots thudded toward the kitchen, her shoulders tensed. "There you are," he said, voice already sharp. "Where have you been all afternoon?" "In the barn," she answered, turning from the window. "I was lying," he snapped, stepping closer. "I saw Hayes riding past the fence line. You think I don't notice?" She backed toward the table. "I didn't speak to him. I swear." Walter's face twisted, and before she could move, his hand caught her wrist. "You think I'm a fool? That you can make me look small in front of this town?" His grip tightened, and fear flashed through her chest like lightning. Something inside her broke then, not with a sound, but with a stillness that was sharper than any shout. She wrenched her wrist free, grabbing the shawl from the chair. "I won't live like this," she said, the words trembling but firm. Walter barked a laugh, the kind that carried no humor. "And where will you go, girl? There's nothing for you out here but me." The wind outside howled, rattling the shutters. She didn't answer. Instead, she bolted for the back door, skirts catching on the splinter frame. She heard the scrape of his boots behind her, the angry curse. But the storm swallowed the sound as she ran across the yard toward the old barn. Lightning split the sky, and in its flash she saw him, Colton Hayes, already dismounting in the shadows. "Isla!" he called over the wind. She stumbled into the barn, breath coming in ragged pulls. Colton was there in an instant, his coat already coming off to wrap around her shoulders. "What happened?" he demanded, scanning her face. "Walter," she managed, her voice shaking. I can't stay." He didn't ask for more. In one swift motion, he saddled his horse, cinching the straps tight. "Then you're coming with me." Thunder rumbled so deep it felt like it came from the ground itself. Colton swung into the saddle and reached a hand down. She hesitated only a heartbeat before gripping it, letting him pull her up in front of him. "Hold on," he said, his voice low and steady in her ear. They burst out into the night, the horses' hooves pounding against the hard-packed earth. The storm was on them now, rain lashing against their faces, lightning flashing over the prairie like the world was being torn in half. Isla clung to him, feeling the heat of his chest even through the soaked fabric of his shirt. Behind them, she thought she heard a shout, Walter's voice carried faintly on the wind, but it was quickly swallowed by the storm. They rode hard, the land rushing past in blurred shadows of mesquite and sage. Each time the lightning flashed, she caught glimpses of the open prairie, wild and endless. For the first time since she'd stepped off the stagecoach in Dry Creek, the air in her lungs felt like it was her own. After what felt like hours, Colton pulled the horse to a slower pace, guiding it toward the dark silhouette of a small cabin tucked against the hills. "This is it," he said, dismounting and helping her down. His hands lingered on her arms for a moment, steadying her. "You'll be safe here." The cabin door creaked as he pushed it open, the warm glow of a fire spilling into the rain. She stepped inside, the scent of wood smoke wrapping around her, and turned back to him. Her voice was soft, almost lost in the fading rumble of thunder. "You came for me." Colton's gaze held hers, steady and sure. Always would have. Chapter 6. Sanctuary in the Hills, 660 words. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the prairie washed clean and glittering under the pale light of dawn. Isla woke to the sound of the wind brushing through the cottonwoods outside, the faint scent of coffee drifting from the other room. She sat up slowly, still in the clothes from the night before, Colton's coat draped over her like a shield. For a long moment, she simply sat there, letting the quiet sink into her bones. It was a different kind of silence than at Walter's ranch. This one wasn't heavy. It was alive, carrying the creak of timber, the faint whicker of a horse outside, and the comforting pop of a fire. The small cabin was plain, but well kept. A rifle rested in a rack near the door, a pair of well-worn boots by the hearth. There were books stacked neatly on a shelf, a rare sight in these parts, and the scent of the wood smoke mixed with a faint tang of leather and saddle soap. Colton was at the stove, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, dark hair mussed from sleep. He glanced over his shoulder when she stepped into the room. "Mornin'," he said, voice still rough from sleep. Hoped the bed wasn't too hard. "It was fine," she said, though the truth was she'd slept better here, in a stranger's cabin, than she had since arriving in Dry Creek. He poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it to her. "Careful. It's strong enough to put hair on a mule." She took a sip and nearly coughed. That's an understatement. The corner of his mouth twitched, a hint of a smile. For a while, they ate in companionable quiet, bread and beans left from the night before. Isla kept catching herself studying him, the way he moved in easy confidence, the way his eyes softened when they landed on her. She wondered what it would be like to belong somewhere that felt like this. But the weight of reality pressed in. "Walter will come looking," she said finally, setting down her cup. "He won't just let me go." Colton's jaw tightened. "I know. That's why we'll be careful. Out here, we got the hills, the creek, and a clear view of anyone riding in. He won't take you without a fight." The thought both steadied and unsettled her. She didn't want Colton hurt on her account. He must have read something in her face because he said, "You're not trouble to me, Isla. Trouble's already out there. I'd rather face it head on than leave you to it alone." Her throat felt tight. "Why?" He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "Because I've seen enough folks backed into corners. Sometimes all a person needs is one door left open." The word stayed with her all morning as they went about the day. She helped him mend a section of fence, her skirts tucked up as she handed him nails. The sun climbed higher, warming her back, and for a while, the work felt like something more than survival. It felt like living. Colton showed her how to feed the horses, his large hands guiding hers as she spread grain in the trough. "This one's Bess," he said, patting a bay mare. "Stubborn as a banker, but she'll carry you through anything." She smiled for the first time in days, and he noticed by late afternoon, clouds began to gather again, not the angry black of last night's storm, but enough to turn the light soft and gold. They sat on the porch steps, watching the horizon. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk wheeled lazily in the sky. "Place is quiet out here," she said. "Too quiet for some," he replied. "But I like it that way." She drew the coat tighter around her shoulders. "I could get used to it." He turned his head toward her, the hint of a smile in his eyes. "Maybe you should." For a moment, she let herself imagine it. A life where morning started with the sound of the creek instead of Walter's voice, where her hands worked the land alongside someone who saw her as more than an obligation. But as the wind shifted, she thought she saw movement on the ridge, just a flicker, a shadow against the gold of the grass. Colton saw it too. His eyes narrowed. "Rider," he said softly, and the peace they'd built in the last day thinned, like a glass pane about to crack. Chapter 7, Gunfire at Dawn, 670 words. The air was cold enough to bite when Isla woke. A pale wash of light spilled to the cabin window, the first sign of dawn stretching over the hills. For a moment, she thought the sound that had roused her was a dream, just the wind through the cottonwoods. Then she heard it again, the muffled thud of hooves. More than one horse. Colton was already at the window, his silhouette sharp against the pale light. "They're here," he said, voice low but certain. She pulled on her shawl and joined him. 3 riders moved through the grass, dark shapes against the gold of the waking prairie. Even from here, she knew the man in front, Walter Bragg. Her stomach dropped. "Colton, get your boots on." He turned from the window, moving with quick, efficient steps. "Stay behind me no matter what happens." She obeyed, her hands shaking as she laced her boots. Outside, the hoofbeats slowed, then stopped. A deep voice, Walter's, carried through the crisp morning air. "Hayes, you got something of mine." Colton stepped onto the porch, his rifle held loose in his hand. "Don't recall stealing anything, Bragg." Walter swung down from his horse, his boots crunching in the frost. "She came to me, contract to contract. You're standing in the way of business that ain't yours. She's a person, not a business deal." Colton's voice was calm, but the steel in it made Isla's heart pound. Walter's 2 hired guns shifted in their saddles, eyes scanning the cabin, hands too close to their holsters. The sky was still that fragile pre-dawn blue, the kind where every sound seemed sharper, like the world was holding its breath. "Last chance, Hayes," Walter said, spitting into the dirt. "Step aside and no one gets hurt." Colton didn't move. If you want her, you'll have to come through me. The silence after that was heavy, stretching taut. Then a shot cracked through the air. Isla flinched, stumbling back against the doorframe. Colton had already moved, taking cover by the porch rail as another bullet splintered the post beside him. His return shot rang out, sending one of the hired guns swearing and ducking behind a boulder. "Stay inside." Colton barked over his shoulder, but she couldn't. Every muscle in her body screamed to run, yet her feet wouldn't carry her away from him. She crouched near the doorway, her eyes locked on a man who, in the space of days, had gone from stranger to something she didn't dare name. Another shot tore through the morning, this one sending sparks from the iron stovepipe. Colton used the distraction to advance, boots crunching in the frost as he fired again, forcing the second gunman to retreat toward his horse. Walter roared in frustration, drawing his revolver and firing twice. One shot grazed Colton's arm, the fabric of his sleeve tearing. He didn't slow. "Walter!" Isla shouted before she could stop herself. He turned toward her voice, just long enough for Colton to close the distance. In one swift motion, Colton knocked the gun from Walter's hand and leveled his own rifle at him. "Go home," Colton said, breathless but steady, "and don't come back." Walter's face twisted. For a moment, Isla thought he'd lunge anyway, but then he spat into the frost and backed toward his horse, muttering curses. His men followed, casting wary glances over their shoulders. The sound of hooves faded into the distance, swallowed by the waking prairie. Colton lowered his rifle, the tension bleeding from his shoulders. When he turned to her, there was a smear of dirt across his cheek and blood on his sleeve, but his eyes were fixed on her with the same unshakable steadiness as the day they'd met. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He stepped closer, his hand brushing her arm, not to guide her, but as if to reassure himself she was really there. "It's over, Isla. He won't be back." But even as the first golden rays of the sun lit the prairie, she knew it wasn't just over. Something had begun here, too. Something dangerous, and maybe something worth every risk. Chapter 8, The Second Chance, 660 words. 2 weeks had passed since the gunfire at dawn. The days had been quiet. Quieter than Isla had thought possible in a world where Walter Bragg still drew breath. Each morning, Colton worked the land while she fed the horses, learned to mend fence posts, and cooked in the little cabin kitchen. The prairie stretched around them like an endless promise, the winter sun low and warm over the hills. But even in the peace, Isla felt the weight of a question pressing on her. Was this her home now, or just a pause before the road pulled her onward again? On the morning the answer came, the air was crisp enough to see her breath. Colton had taken her out riding, his idea, though she suspected he'd noticed how she lingered by the corral each day, watching Bess toss her head impatiently. They rode along the creek, its banks lined with winter-bare cottonwoods. The sky above was an unbroken sweep of pale blue. "You ride like you were born to it," Colton said, glancing at her from atop his gelding. She laughed softly. "I'm not sure I even rode twice before I came here. I think Bess just takes pity on me." "Bess don't take pity on nobody," he said with a grin. "She respects you." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the sound of hooves muffled in the frost-hardened earth. Isla found herself thinking about the first day she'd stepped off that stagecoach, how small the town had felt, how large the cage Walter had built around her, and how, without warning, Colton had been the one to show her a door she'd never dared to imagine was there. When they reached a rise overlooking the prairie, Colton pulled his horse to a stop. The land fell away in golden waves, the low sun painting every blade of grass in firelight. It looked endless. It looked free. He dismounted and held out a hand to help her down. She slid from the saddle, the cold air brushing her cheeks. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," he said, his voice quieter now. She folded her arms against the chill. "What's that?" Colton looked out over the land for a moment before turning back to her. "You don't belong to anyone, Isla. Not to Walter. Not to me. But if you'll have me, I'd be proud to belong to you." The words sank into her like warm sunlight, chasing away the last chill of winter in her bones. "I'm not," she started, then stopped. "I'm not sure I know how to belong anywhere anymore." "That's all right," he said, taking a step closer. "We can figure out together. I ain't asking you to be something you're not. Just stay. Build something with me here." Her breath caught in the stillness between them. The sound of the wind in the grass seemed louder, the sky wider. She realized that in all her years of imagining escape, she'd never dared to picture what came after. And yet, here it was being offered like a gift. She smiled then, a slow, certain smile. "I think I like that." Colton's answering smile was small but steady, the kind that felt like it would hold against any storm. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. The wind shifted, carrying the faint cry of a coyote from somewhere far off. They stood together on that rise, looking out over the land. The prairie didn't feel so endless anymore. It felt like theirs. As the sun dipped lower, Colton squeezed her hand. "Come on, let's head back. Bess will be wanting her supper." They mounted up and rode side by side toward the cabin, the horizon stretching wide and bright ahead of them. For the first time in a long time, Isla didn't think about where she'd been or what she'd run from. She thought about where she was going, toward a life she'd chosen, and a man who'd seen her worth before she'd even remembered herself. The sun was sinking low, turning the plains into a sea of molten gold. A warm wind carried the scent of sagebrush, stirring Isla's hair as she stood on the porch of Colton's cabin, watching the horses graze along the fence line. In the distance, the faint sound of a saloon piano drifted from Dry Creek, mingling with the steady creak of the windmill. Walter Bragg was gone for good. The sheriff had ridden out that morning with news. Walter had left the territory, too shamed and too beaten to return. For the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, Isla's chest felt light. She heard Colton's boots on the boards before she saw him. When he stepped beside her, the sunset caught in his eyes, making them as warm as the land they'd fought for. "Looks like we made it," he said softly. She smiled, the kind that came from deep in her bones. "We did, and for the first time, I feel like I'm home." Colton reached into his pocket, pulling out a small leather string with a silver token, a piece from his mother's wedding band. He pressed it into her palm. "A promise," he said, "not to keep you, but to walk beside you. Always." Her fingers curled around it. "Then I promise the same." As the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, they stood together, the prairie stretching endlessly ahead. Two souls who'd outrun the dust and danger, only to find each other at the end of the trail.